Cheyenne Moore is a Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Network coordinator. She has a BS from Dickinson College and an MS from Bucknell University, along with graduate work at the University of Pittsburgh, with an emphasis on botany, plant ecology, and plant conservation genetics. Cheyenne oversees the development and implementation of recovery plans for Pennsylvania threatened and endangered plant species on public and private lands, working with our Natural Heritage Program staff, DCNR Bureau of Forestry staff, and other public and private stakeholders. So at this point, I will turn things over to Cheyenne Moore to get us started.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about just what Amy said, and I will give the disclosure that I was out pulling stilt grass in the heat today, so if I take a minute at some point, that might be why. But yeah, I'm going to talk about some rare, threatened, and endangered plants and some of the cool places that they live. So what I'll be talking about, this is just sort of a brief overview, but give you an idea of more detail what I'll be saying today. Talk a little bit about my role here at DCNR. What actually is a rare, threatened, or endangered plant and how we define those things and how plants become rare, threatened, or endangered, where these plants are, some of the ways that DCNR protects the plants, and I'm going to do a couple case studies. I'll be pausing for questions in between here, as Amy mentioned. I'll do a case study on plant genetics, and then I'll do a case study on rare plant recovery, and then to end on a sort of uplifting note of what we all can do to help promote the conservation of native plants. All right. So I'm the PPCN coordinator, or the Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Network coordinator. And I put this PCA, the Plant Conservation Alliance logo down here to kind of remind myself to tell you all that if you're familiar with PCAs or Plant Conservation Alliances, PCN is pretty much the same thing. We just decided to call it a network instead of an alliance. So there's no real difference. We belong to the PCA network. We're modeled pretty heavily after the Georgia PCA, which does a lot of great work. So PCN, PCA, very similar. Basically, one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is identifying how to safeguard rare species. So when we have a rare species, they're often in decline, and one of the first things we need to do is figure out how to stop that decline. And so that could be a safeguarding measure like fencing or removing invasives, things like that. And then coordinating some of that same stewardship effort as well as the monitoring effort to help us understand if the plants are continuing to decline or if they're doing better, those sorts of things, general trends with populations of our rare plants. And some of that can be a little trickier than you think. Sometimes it's just counting plants, but sometimes it's a little trickier whenever you have lots and lots of plants, or you have plants that you can't quite tell one individual from the next. So it's a lot of brainstorming about the most time-effective ways to do that will be informative. I help identify why species are rare, which can be pretty tricky sometimes. And then I help coordinate recovery of species, which means lots of things depending on the species. And I'll get into that a little bit more as I go through my talk. So to give you some background on Pennsylvania plants, I tried to label all my plants photos. Many of you might know this is Mountain Laurel, our state plant. I didn't label it, so apologies. But Pennsylvania is home to about 3,000 plant species. About 2/3 of those are considered to be native. And then DCNR native plants, we have classified 582 of those. And when I say classified, that could be that we consider them to be rare, threatened, or endangered, or we have species that are watch list species. Classified species also encompasses plants that were once listed and have since been delisted, which is good. It could be plants that are extirpated or gone, which is not as good. It can be species with undetermined statuses, so we're still considering how we want to list them. But that's what classified by DCNR means. And then 349 of those are considered to be rare, threatened, or endangered within Pennsylvania. So what is rare, threatened, and endangered? Rare plants are plant species which are uncommon within Pennsylvania because they're found restricted geographically or just generally in low numbers. And we have 39 species that are considered rare. One of them being this one, Lupin paranensis. It's also found in cultivation, so you may have seen it in a garden, but it does occur naturally in Pennsylvania and it's considered to be rare. Threatened species are sort of the middle ground. They're species that may become endangered within the foreseeable future throughout the range in Pennsylvania. So jeweled shooting star Primula facetii is one of those. We have 78 species that are listed as threatened. And then the highest priority species are those that are endangered or in imminent danger of extinction or extirpation throughout the range in Pennsylvania. And that is the most highly represented category with 232 species, including this plant here, Polemonium rembrandtii or bog Jacob's ladder. And I mostly focus on threatened and endangered species. Actually, most of my work focuses on threatened and endangered species within Pennsylvania that are also rare on some scale at the global level, but we can talk more about that later if you have questions. But since I'm focusing on Pennsylvania, I wanted to broaden it out a bit. And so this kind of gets to the cool habitats part of this. So rare plants often grow in really uncommon places. They're not really growing in just random wood lots. I mean, sometimes they are, but interesting places often spawn interesting plants. And so I'm going to cover a few of those sorts of places. I'm going to talk about a couple of different types of barrens. So shale barrens, this is a photo of a shale barren, and serpentine barrens. Here's a photo of serpentine barrens. Peatlands, this one. So those can be fens, which are more basic and nutrient rich, or it could be an acidic wetland that's obviously more acidic. We have vernal pools right here. I'll talk about those. And then I'll end talking about river scours or riparian scours, which are one of my favorite places to work. Okay, so shale barrens. What is a shale barren? Kind of what it sounds like. Many of you are probably familiar with shale rock. That's what's there. And it's often pretty exposed, kind of crumbly, and the soil's rather thin. And what you get there, you might not think there would be a lot of interesting stuff, but because it's a kind of a hard place to live, you do end up with some pretty specially adapted plants there. And so here are some photos of shale barrens. They can be sort of steep, rocky cliff sides, or they can be flatter. Here's a photo of some folks from Western Pennsylvania Conservancy doing some invasive removal at one of the shale barrens that they own. And two of the really cool plants that I really love from shale barrens, Kate's mountain clover, Trifolium virginicum, and this PE here I put for Pennsylvania endangered. You see a PT, that means that's Pennsylvania threatened, or PR, Pennsylvania rare. But a lot of the plants I'm showing you today are threatened or endangered within the state. So Kate's mountain clover, it is a really cool plant. We actually just found 3 new populations of it within the last 2 years, which I think is really cool. One of them is on private land, and the landowners have been really receptive to letting state botanists and some of our contracted botanists go out and keep track of it. I'm really excited about this one. It's one that we don't have a lot of research on. And so we're hoping to be able to gather some more data on what sort of habitats it likes and how well it does as far as throughout time. And then this one is mountain pimpernel. It might look really familiar because it has a congener or a species in the same genus that is also in Cnidia. It is, I believe the common name is yellow pimpernel. They look pretty much the same when they're flowering, but their fruits are different. And this one, mountain pimpernel, Cnidia montana, is only found along a couple roadsides and shale barrens in southern Pennsylvania. And the other kind of barren I want to talk about is even more special. So these are photos of barrens. I think this one is State Line Barren, and this one is Goat Hill Barrens. And these are all in the southern part of Pennsylvania, sort of right on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. They're all sort of concentrated. And what makes a serpentine barren is the bedrock. So it's a serpentine bedrock, which just means that it's serpentine rock, and these contain lots of minerals like nickel, magnesium, and chromium, and those are pretty heavy metals, pretty heavy, toxic minerals to most plants. And so the fact that plants are growing there, they have to have special crates usually to deal with that. There's also really high temperatures in a lot of these places. And so when this rock weathers, it releases this, it creates really poor soils that most plants wouldn't want to live in. And so this creates a pretty harsh environment, but many of the plants that live here can tolerate it, and that makes them pretty rare in most cases because they're living in this really extreme environment. Oops. All right, so I put 3 plants on this one. I couldn't help myself. These are all pretty much endemic to just these serpentine barrens. You're not really going to see them anywhere else. I mentioned with the Tinidia montana, it kind of grows along shaly roadsides. But these aren't going to grow anywhere even like kind of serpentine. They're just going to be in these serpentine barrens. The first one I have here is serpentine aster, Sympiotrichum depaupeраtum. It's just a cute little aster. It doesn't really look super showy, but it's only found in these barrens, and I think that's super cool. This other one is round leaf fame flower, and it's pretty cute. I'm a little biased, but it looks basically like grass when it's not flowering. It's really hard to notice, but then when it is flowering, you can get these really massive clumps of plants that have their little pink flowers. We actually had a controlled burn at one of these serpentine barrens, and the year after, there was just a whole field of these almost. So they're pretty cool. And this one, I think, is the one I'm most excited to tell you about. It really is called berry hairy chickweed, Cerastium velutinum var villainosum. There is a Cerastium velutinum var velutinum, which is just hairy chickweed. This very hairy chickweed is potentially only found at one serpentine barren in Pennsylvania. It was described by a botanist a couple hundred years ago, and there have been a couple other populations that folks have thought might be this very hairy chickweed, but so far the only truly confirmed population is here in Pennsylvania. And it looks pretty similar to just the regular hairy chickweed, but it is hairier, and the leaves are a little bit more clustered together. And there's actually some genetic work being done on it right now by a professor. And so I'm excited to see what he finds and see how closely related it is to just the regular old hairy chickweed. All right, next I'm going to talk about peatlands. I wanted to show you this map from WPC, Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. They have been doing a really large peatlands project inventorying them. And so all these little black areas are places that they consider to have peatlands. You'll notice that there's a pretty high concentration up here in the northwest as well as in the northeast. And that's because peatlands are pretty associated with glaciation. So here's some photos of peatlands. You can see that they can look pretty different. It's a very broad classification of wetlands that's basically classified by the accumulation of organic matter or peat under watery or waterlogged conditions. This organic material is usually made up of decaying mosses, mostly sphagnum, and other plant material, and the rate that it accumulates and decomposes kind of indicates what kind of peatland you have. So you can break down the two broader categories. I'm going to talk about more, but I just wanted to keep it kind of broad. Like I said, they can be pretty different. This one almost looks dry. I promise it is wet, but it's mostly open and kind of shrubby. This one has some very small trees, is grassy. This one has some larger grassy plants. Again, some shrubs, but one of the things they all have in common are they're so kind of open areas that are maintained. The openness is maintained by the hydrology. You're not going to get big trees in a really wet area. And so the tree lines are off in the distance, keeping it nice and open, letting lots of sunlight in, and it's also very wet, which facilitates some cool plants. All right, so the first one I'm going to talk about are these acidic wetlands. And here I'm showing yellow fringed orchid or Cynthera ciliaris. This I have TU here, and I wanted to explain that. TU is tentatively undetermined, which means the species is under review in Pennsylvania for how we want to classify it. Do we want to consider it to be rare, endangered, threatened, or do we not want to list it at all yet at this point? And the way that we do that in the state is we have a rare plant forum once a year where anyone, usually botanists that work for the state or contract out, can come and present a plant and say, I think this should be listed because of these data, and I've been doing surveys and there's less of this plant and I'm concerned. So that's sort of how that works. And if you have more questions about that, we can definitely talk about them. And then the other one I wanted to show you is bog Jacob's ladder, which I already showed you once, but I've been doing a lot of work on this species. And so I wanted to show it to you again. You can see in this photo, maybe you can see, it actually has some fruit pods on it. So it's getting some fruit ready. This photo over here on the right-hand side is actually a large stretch of bog Jacob's ladder, those sort of darker bluish green leaves, and you can see some fern in the background, but it's this nice open area. And these plants, those sort of vertical lines, those are actually the stems with the bog Jacob's ladder fruit. And so this population's doing really well. I was excited to see that earlier this week. But these are found in the more acidic wetlands. These are usually classified as sort of stagnant bogs or shrubby wetlands or forested wetlands. Usually there's a lack of oxygen in the soil that slows down decomposition, and the rate of plant production can then exceed the rate of decay and results in the accumulation of peat. These are usually nutrient poor and as well as acidic, and they can influence the species that grow there. So sort of in the same way that those shale barrens were that I told you about, and the serpentine barrens, sometimes poor conditions can facilitate some really cool plants. Then the other type of peatland I wanted to talk about is kind of the other end of the spectrum, these nutrient-rich fens. And these are really, really cool. Often they're fed by limestone. Limestone's something I didn't really like separate out as a separate habitat type, but usually limestone is behind a lot of cool plants and nutrients to help those cool plants. Unlike acid peatlands, the decomposition here, these wetlands are more productive and more rapid, usually have more flowing water, at least nearby. There's usually more microbial activity that facilitate decomposition. And then the environmental conditions, the water and things support fast plant growth. So it's a little bit more of a fast-paced ecosystem. And the two plants I wanted to highlight here, spreading globe flower, Trolleus laxus. It's Pennsylvania endangered. It has a really interesting range. It's kind of split in the US. And we only have a few populations left of this in the state. Unfortunately, they're all on private land and we've been having trouble accessing them to make sure the plants are okay and see them, but they're a really pretty plant and it's one that we want to hopefully do more work with. And the other plant here is dragon's mouth, Arethusa bulbosa, and it's Pennsylvania endangered. I do want to point out that this is an orchid, and on the last slide, in the acid wetland, that was also an orchid. And so orchids love wet places, but depending on the species, they might be in a more nutrient-rich site or they might be in a more acidic site. But as long as it's a wetland, that you'll probably find an orchid somewhere around. All right, vernal pools, I just wanted to touch on quickly. These are really dependent on geology. There's different kinds all around the state. They can be influenced by glaciation. They could be because of erosion of bedrock. So around the South Mountain region, if you're local or sort of local to this area, South Mountain, you might be familiar with it. There's some of these vernal pools and those can kind of develop by limestone weathering away and then just fill with water. They're usually kind of ephemeral in a sense. They're these depressions in the spring, they fill with water. Often these are known more for really cool herps or frogs and salamanders and things like that use them a lot, but they're also home to some pretty cool plants. One that I wanted to highlight is this northeastern bulrush or Scirpus ancestricatatus. And it was actually federally listed. I believe it still might be federally listed, but whenever a plant's federally listed, usually states try to put in a bigger effort to go look for it, survey the populations we already have. And in Pennsylvania, after some habitat modeling, And going back and looking at data, we actually found lots of new populations of this here in Pennsylvania, mostly in these vernal pool areas. And it turns out we're actually sort of the stronghold for this species in its distribution, which I think is really cool. All right, and as promised, riparian scour is one of my favorite habitats to talk about. So this is along the Youghiogheny River in southwestern Pennsylvania, the more fast-moving river in some places, not all necessarily, but as you can see, there are larger rocks at the banks. There are kind of larger boulders, and that's sort of the habitat that plants have to grow on. Over here, this is a slower moving waterway. I believe this is the Allegheny River in northwestern Pennsylvania, and you can see there's sort of these cobbly stones here. There's some small trees growing, but again, these are really open areas often, and that openness is facilitated by high water flow or ice scouring. So that just means if a river freezes over at a point in the winter, and that ice breaks up and comes down in chunks, it scours away trees, hoping to keep that nice and open and get lots of sunlight to these plants. One of the things that I found, one of the reasons I love river scours is because I worked on them for my master's. And one of the things that we came across was that this ice scouring is becoming a lot less common as climate changes. And it's actually letting these trees get a lot bigger than what they normally would get, shading out some of these really cool rare plants. So that's something that I think about a lot in these really interesting habitats. Two of the plants I'm going to talk about here, Marshallia pulchra, beautiful barber's buttons, is PE. It's actually a really interesting story. It used to be Marshallia grandiflora, but it ended up that was actually a different species entirely that's actually now extinct. It was never really in Pennsylvania. And so we had to kind of go back and name this plant because it wasn't what we thought Marshallia grandiflora was. So Marshallia pulchra, it grows just along the Allegheny River, or the Youghiogheny River, sorry, in southwestern Pennsylvania. We've been doing a lot of surveys. It's also federally listed, so it's one of the species that we try to spend a lot of time on and make sure it gets a good amount of attention. And then the other one I wanted to talk about is blue false indigo, or Baptisia australis, which is Pennsylvania threatened. And I did my master's dissertation on this plant. So I think it's really cool. I think it's really pretty. It grows in these sort of open prairie-like habitats along 4 waterways in Pennsylvania, primarily the Allegheny River. And these have grasses like big bluestem and Indian grass. Looks a lot like a prairie. And one of the things that has been impacting it is those trees that I mentioned. With less ice scour, we're seeing more trees that are kind of changing this habitat that's really important for these plants. So I just told you about a bunch of rare plants and where they live. And I want to talk about why plants are rare. And that could be in part because these habitats are pretty rare. Like I showed you, they're really special. And maybe you don't see a bog every day or a serpentine barren, which is understandable. So limited habitat is one of the things, but we also have to remember that those habitats were once much more widespread than they are today. And we've created development in a lot of these places, or we've altered things. Like I mentioned with the river scour, that habitat has decreased in part because of climate change, but also in part because of folks building homes along the river. Who doesn't want to wake up and look at a river? But that also involves changing what it's like there, the habitat is. And so thinking about that. Succession, which just means a lot of those places that I just showed you are pretty open. If you remember, there's not a lot of trees there. But succession does happen in a lot of places naturally, especially places where trees can grow. And so trees grow up, they block out the sun, plants get less sunlight, and the plant communities change. The ones that might be rare and like a lot of sunlight don't have a lot of sunlight anymore, and they might slowly fade away and be replaced by other plants. And if there's no other open habitat nearby for those rare plants to move into, they might just be gone. Deer are another problem. Deer love to eat plants. If you have a garden that isn't fenced, you probably know that. They think a lot of our native plants are delicious, and so they munch on them. Invasive species, that's not usually the main cause, but it doesn't help anything whenever you're a native plant and you have to compete against a plant that hasn't evolved with any native competitors or native herbivores, and so they have an unfair advantage against you, and they're kind of unfair competition, especially when you're being nibbled by deer and your sunlight's being shaded out. So overall, there's usually lots of reasons why any one given plant is rare. And sometimes we just don't know which ones or the combinations. And that's a lot of what my job is trying to figure that out and make sure we're taking care of our native plants. I did want to point out too that sometimes we don't know why plants are growing in place. Forgot to put photos on this slide, but the mountain pimpernel that I mentioned, Nidium montana, it grows along roadsides. It grows along shaly roadsides, which makes sense. It likes shale barrens, but why not grow along more shaly roadsides? It only grows along a few. So sometimes we don't have all the answers. There's a rare orchid, Isotrium medialoides. We have one population in the state. It grows in a really common forest type, a type of forest that I've walked through lots and lots of times, but I've never seen Isotria in any of those forests. It is an orchid, so maybe it has a fungal associate that I don't understand, but it's something that for us to think about and hopefully understand one day. And then glade spurge, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. I'm going to talk to you more about it later, but sometimes we don't really know why it's growing where it is. And I just wanted to touch on, before I ask for questions and move into some case studies, the ways that DCNR can protect rare plants and some of the ways we try to protect rare plants. We can designate wild plant sanctuaries. These can be designated on private land or land that DCNR owns, like Bureau of Forestry land. And that just means that that land is protected a little bit more. So if it's Bureau of Forestry land, we're going to be a lot more careful if there's a timber sale nearby, things like that. On Bureau of Forestry land, we do lots of invasive species management. Our service foresters can advise private landowners on how to do their own invasive species management. We have a really strong wetland and riparian buffer program, which can be helpful for some of these aquatic spaces. Fencing, so if it's a rare plant on Bureau of Forestry land, we often will put up a fence if needed, if it's something threatened by deer. And then canopy thinning. So sometimes, like I said, succession happens and the plants aren't getting enough sunlight. And so we can do some artificial canopy thinning to help get some sunlight back for plants. All right, and I can pause for questions now before I jump into case studies. Now that was a lot of content, so I didn't want to just like bulldoze through the whole presentation. My next two little sections are case studies about other specific plants, but if you have a question now, I would be happy to try to answer it. Let's see if I can see it. Okay, we had a question about yellow fringed orchids. What size are the flowers? Yeah, they look really big in that photo. I would say they're probably, with their fringes included, about the size of a quarter. So they can get to be pretty tall. They have lots of flowers depending on how big the plant is. Yes, Allison asked about, does Pennsylvania use S1, S2, S3, S4, S5 designations to compare plant status with other states? And we do. Yeah, so we have a sort of rough correlation with the S ranks and our P ranks. And whenever I do my work, I consider the S ranks. So if you're not familiar with S ranks, those are designated by criteria from NatureServe. So whenever we do this work, we use NatureServe, we use Biotics, their platform, to assess the plants. So it's these P ranks also come from the S ranks. They're very interconnected. So whenever someone proposes that we make something PE, often they run it through the NatureServe rank calculator and it came out as an S1. So yeah, we use the S ranks, we use the G ranks, which are the global ranks. I do have a link at the end that kind of touches on that, and I can tell you more about it too. But yes, we do use the S rings, and they are very useful to compare to other states. Kathy Lewis asked if Baptisia seems popular in nurseries. Does this help? That was something that I thought a lot about during my master's. I don't know if it necessarily, helps our native populations. It's a really pretty plant. It doesn't often escape cultivation in Pennsylvania, so it's not like you're going to have like a wild population of Baptisia getting into our waterways in most cases, unless you're living in one of those homes right along one of our rivers. So it doesn't necessarily help our native populations. It doesn't necessarily hurt them either. It's a good pollinator plant. It's a pretty native. There's not really any major problems with having it as a yard plant, but doesn't necessarily help our native plants, which is okay. All right. All right, if there are no other questions, I will move forward. So yeah, I'm going to talk more about Baptisia now because I can't help myself. I studied the genetics of Baptisia in Pennsylvania. And so this is sort of a case study where talking about where a plant grows and how it impacts its genetic structure. All right, so one of my big questions of my dissertation was how many genetic groups of Baptisia australis are in Pennsylvania. So these are maps of where things occur in Pennsylvania. So this map here on the right is a zoomed out shot. So it shows all the populations I sampled in purple, and those are along 3 waterways. So you can see in the north, we have a big cluster, and then in the south, there's one population on the Youghiogheny River. Now this is a sort of more zoomed in view with the green points on the left-hand side. It shows you a little bit more how spread out the points are. But again, they're pretty clustered together in comparison to this Youghiogheny River point. And so my hypothesis going into this as a grad student was that we might see 2 genetically distinct groups, the Youghiogheny River down here, and then the Allegheny River, and then these 2 tributaries that we also sampled populations along. And that's not necessarily what we found. We don't necessarily have to, completely understand this figure. It was pulled from my dissertation, but what this is showing is that down here we have the Clarion River populations. So they were the green samples, and they're all clustered together genetically. This is all based on genetic sequence data. And then we have the Youghiogheny River up here in orange color, and it's clustering all by itself. The brown is actually West Virginia, because I was curious to see what our Pennsylvania populations look like relative to West Virginia. So that's from outside of Pennsylvania, those brown dots. And then all these blue dots are from along the Allegheny River, and the red being the Red Bank Creek. And you can see those all clustered together somewhat, but they're also pretty spread out. It's not like they're one big cloud. So this is one of the first, visualizations I did of my data, and I did a lot more analyses after that. I did some clustering analyses, I did structure analyses, and I'm not going to show you all of them because they all sort of ended up telling the same story, which is this. Because we have 3 sort of genetic entities in the state of Pennsylvania. So the Clarion River clusters by itself. Those plants are genetically distinct from any of the other Baptisia plants in Pennsylvania. And the Youghiogheny River clusters by itself, genetically distinct. And then all the rest of them in these boxes, these gray boxes, they all cluster together as one genetic entity. But if you look a little bit more closely, you can see that they're starting to become more distant and not have as much gene flow as they did historically. And I thought this was really interesting because, the Clarion River, these 2 populations are really close to the Youghiogheny River. So the fact that they weren't having a lot of gene flow with the Allegheny River, while these ones down here on Red Bank Creek were, I thought was really interesting. And then this being different, but something that, the genetics can't capture, but me as a person that was out there collecting things did notice was that the habitat on the Youghiogheny River and the Clarion River were really different from the habitat all along the Allegheny River and the Red Bank Creek. And so those plants have been living there for a long time, probably hundreds of years, specializing in those habitats. for the Clarion River and the Octane River, larger boulders, different plant communities. And so the genetics reflected that. So whenever we think about, moving plants around, I don't necessarily think it's going to be harmful, but it's just something to remember that plants are adapting to where they're living and it is impacting their genetics. Oh, and this is my shameless plug. If you don't get enough content tonight, if I didn't deliver with spectacular photos, check out this video. This was actually a video my master's advisor did about some of my research working on blue false indigo. He has a YouTube series called Plants Are Two. All of his videos are amazing. There's one in Hawaii. If you like looking at really beautiful plants, I would recommend checking them out. I will give Amy this link so she can send it out to everyone. Yeah, they're pretty short videos. This one's 11 minutes. Some of them are a little longer, but I think they're pretty interesting and really beautifully done. All right, and this is my last case study. It's kind of like an uplifting, upbeat case study. I'm talking about clade spurge and its recovery. The scientific name is Euphorbia purpurea. It's Pennsylvania endangered. So there are 7 populations in Pennsylvania. A researcher who also happens to be my undergraduate research advisor back in the 90s was hired to do some surveys, and she noticed that this plant was there, but it had declined a lot since the last person that did a survey 10 or so years ago. And that kind of alarmed her, and so she started doing regular monitoring of the plants. Not much was really known about the reasons for decline, so she started going back every year and checking on plants at all of the public land locations, which I think is 6 of the 7 populations. And what she found was that the main threats that she could determine were deer, low reproduction, and maybe light availability. So she had monitored these plants for many years. Like I said, she started in the 90s, and she was noticing that if a deer nipped off the top of one of these plants here, you can see the flowers at the top, if it just nipped that top off, the next year that plant would grow back and it wouldn't flower. And it probably wouldn't flower again for another 5 years. So just one little deer nip, a deer just having a taste to see if that plant tastes good, could knock that plant growth back by 5 years, which is quite impressive. Low reproduction, so even the plants that were making fruits and flowers, there weren't a lot of seedlings growing around them. And then light availability also seemed to be an issue. They seem to like more light, they seem to flower more when they have more light, and the canopy seemed to be closing in a lot of places where they were growing. And I should say, like I said, we don't really know a whole lot about where this plant likes to grow. It grows in these sort of wet, skunk cabbagey swamps, but it doesn't really like to be super wet all the time. So one of the things we think is that deer have pushed it back into areas that aren't optimal habitat, but it's kind of safe from deer. And so we want to get at where it actually likes to live, not just where it's able to survive and not be browsed by deer. So what Carol, the researcher that started this whole project, has done, I say what we've done, but it's been a lot of her effort with some of my support and DCNR support, but largely her. She's fenced many of these plants. So she's put up fences at all the public land sites, small fences around single plants, large fences around whole populations, making sure that deer can't browse them. She started collecting seed and growing out plants to augment populations. So here on the bottom left, there's a photo of some plants that she was growing out. She noticed that they weren't doing really great growing in the sites they were, in part because of the skunk cabbage I mentioned. The seeds were actually having trouble getting down to the dirt, or when they did start growing, the skunk cabbage was sort of shading them out and keeping them from getting big enough. So she's been growing them out in a greenhouse to get them big enough to go out. She tags them, she tracks where the seed came from, what parent, what population. She knows if she goes out, this came from plant F at site 2B. Plant F flowers every year, and this plant was a seed from plant F that I grew 5 years ago. So she's really good about keeping track of things, which I think is amazing. And then daylighting, so allowing some of that sunlight in. We've cut back some small trees and branches and things to allow more light to get to the plant. And the take-home message here is that we're on the right track. All the populations that she's been stewarding have increased in number of individuals and reproductive individuals. I spent some time out there with her this year, and she said this is the best year for flowering and fruit production that she's seen since she started monitoring the population. So while we're kind of still hand-holding them, they're doing a lot better, and hopefully we can start to, not have to help as much. And one of the things we're thinking about is maybe starting some de novo populations or brand new populations, habitat that we think might be appropriate, and taking some of her seedlings and putting them out and monitoring them to see how they do. And we're really excited about maybe trying that out next year. All right, so I want to wrap up with some of the things that we can do as citizens to help with native plant conservation. And one of the things that I think this presentation might show is that maintaining varied habitats is important. I think there's a lot of focus on, woodlands and planting trees, and trees are great. Pollinator mixes are really popular right now, and pollinators are great, but it's also important to kind of embrace what you have. If you have a really shaly, rocky backyard, there are plants that will grow there that are native. It might take some research to figure out what's appropriate. You might not necessarily want to be planting rare, threatened, and endangered plants out there, but there are other species that would be happy and be really pretty. And so just kind of embracing what you have. If you have a wet backyard, plant some of those more peatlandy plants. You don't necessarily have to go for, what everyone else has. Planting native plants, I touched on that. I have some resources on my resource side to help maybe with some native plant selection. I think one of the important things whenever we think about planting native plants is thinking about where they came from, just making sure they're ethically sourced. I know that I go to a lot of native plant sales, and I'm sure most of the nurseries, if not all of them, have ethically sourced their plants. But I always like to say, even if it's just to find out if it's from Pennsylvania or not, where do you know where these plants are from? Because sometimes they're from Pennsylvania, sometimes from Maryland. It's not necessarily a bad thing if it's not from Pennsylvania, but I always just like to ask, know where my plants are from. But yeah, I think native plants are the way to go. There's many, many beautiful native plants, not just the rare, threatened, and endangered ones. One of the things I kind of wanted to plug is PA Master Naturalist. So if you're if you're hardcore into this presentation, if you're I want to know how to monitor rare plants, I want to see rare plants, the Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Network actually has an agreement with the PA Master Naturalist that in the coming years, we're going to start asking them to help us with some rare plant surveys and maybe some stewardship of a few of our really important rare plant sites. So the PA Master Naturalists, they do some training. They're really great. They're really understanding of, our goals. And so if you want to be out there doing rare plant work, I would say look into the PA Master Naturalist. And even if you don't end up working with PPCN, they have lots of amazing things to teach folks. And then just being an advocate for native plants, being an advocate for conservation. Yeah, I know I've had to get more comfortable talking to people about native plants since I took this position. Sometimes, I'll be out in the woods and, doing surveys, and you might see someone along a trail that's picking plants, or in a particular case, wild ramps or leeks. And, you're allowed to pick state forest land enough for yourself, but you shouldn't be picking, more than that. That's kind of what our legislation says. And so sometimes you have to say, that's a lot of, this resource, and you shouldn't be taking that. So just making sure you're thinking about that in your everyday life, thinking about where things come from, thinking about, if someone asks you, oh, where'd you get that plant? And just making sure you say oh, it's a native plant. Isn't it really beautiful? Getting more people excited about native plants, I think, is important. So this slide has some resources. I will briefly touch on what some of them are, just in case you want to look into them. I sent all these to Amy so she can make sure you will have access. If you're interested in seeing what plants are rare, threatened, and endangered in Pennsylvania, that's that first link. We work a lot and are part of the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. So this website actually can give you a list of every plant or actually organism in Pennsylvania that is considered to be very threatened or endangered. It can also show you that S rank as well as the G rank. So the nature serve calculation for how secure it is in within a state or within in a global scale. If you want to know more about how we list plants, our listing process, how plants get listed, this is the link for that. Our really brief webpage as the PPCN is here. I get a lot of my information from the Center for Plant Conservation, so it can tell you a little bit more about the nitty gritty of some of my everyday work, thinking about seeds and genetics and things like that. If you're interested in PA Master Naturalist, here's their website. Native gardening info. I'm sure many of you are interested in native plants and native gardening and you have your own resources, but DCNR has a couple. Those are the first two links. And then one that I found recently that I think is really cool is this Virginia solar site for native plants. You can, it was originally made for companies that are putting up solar fields and want to plant native plants under the solar panels or around solar panels. But you can basically use this sort of calculator, say that you want to have, plants grow this tall and your soil is this way, and you want it to flower at this time of year, and it can spit out a list of plants that would be appropriate that are native. And again, it's for Virginia, but Pennsylvania and Virginia have a lot of similar plants. So you can always check that out, cross-reference with our PA Flora guides. But I think that one's really cool too, if you're looking for something pretty specific. All right, that is all the material that I had prepped for you all, and I would be happy to take any more questions now.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheyenne. If you want to stop sharing your screen,
Sure.
we can go side by side again, and happy to help with questions.
All right.
So yeah, thank you so much for that. That's absolutely wonderful. And as Cheyenne mentioned, she shared all of those resource links with me. And so I'll be creating links that I'll share with you all, and you'll have access to everything after the presentation about early next week when I'll have everything all put together. And I also do want to put a plug in for Jenkins. If you guys are local and aren't aware, we have a garden shop and we do sell native plants. We sell native plants from about mid-April to about mid-October. So we do have plants available. Summer is a tough time. This is definitely not the week that you want to go out planting plants, but we do have things available. So in the resource list, I made myself a note. I'm going to put a link to the garden shop webpage, which often has a plant availability button. And if you click on that, we update that list every few weeks as we see how our inventory is going. So again, if you're local and you're looking for native plants for your garden, Jenkins is a spot you guys can consider to come and shop. All right, let's see what questions came through. So yeah, someone has a question about which serpentine barren is very hairy chickweed found in. So maybe more specifically, which barren?
Yeah, that one I think is in Goat Hill, if I remember correctly, which is I think our largest barren.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, very hairy chickweed. That is an awesome plant name. Another question here, I'm just going to read it out loud so everyone can hear it. Our local group is keeping a native plant in a public park. We planted seeds for Cooper's milk vetch, which I believe is extirpated in Pennsylvania, but the seeds are from the Midwest. Only one survived, but it's growing very well. Is this a complete shot in the dark to match a missing plant with its faunal associations?
Yeah, so this is something we think a lot about because sometimes people plant things that, we're not expecting to see. And so our botanist will go and find something and be like, well, is this really growing here? Or did someone plant this here? And I think a lot of times, if it's doing well, that means that it probably likes where it's growing. A lot of times when things are extirpated, we don't necessarily always know why. So in that particular case, I don't know if it's a complete shot in the dark. It might not be. I mean, if it seems to be doing well, it was once native here for sure. It is a Midwestern genotype probably, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. It's just something to keep in mind. So if anyone ever does find it and want to record it in a database, then they know, oh, it was planted here. It was a Midwestern genotype, and just making sure that we keep things in mind whenever we're planting things. As long as we keep track of what we're doing, I think it's good.
There we go. So this question, I'm pretty sure that's the acronym for Pennsylvania Master Naturalist. So do you know if PAMN, Pennsylvania Master Naturalist, is running any programs conserving plants in Southeast Pennsylvania?
I don't know for sure. I know that plants are one of their more high demand areas, I guess. People get really excited about plants, they were telling me. I know they do run something on plants about on a yearly basis. Don't know if they move around where it is, but I would reach out to them. The Michelle Richards, the woman that runs it, is really great and excited to have new people involved. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is where PA Master Naturalist has folks involved, because sometimes their existing volunteers aren't always close to some of the rare plant populations we need work done at. So don't hesitate to reach out. You might be in like a really strategically placed location that could be really helpful with some populations.
There we go. Great. All right. Last call for questions. Is there anyone else out there that might have a question? Cheyenne, I actually have a question while people are thinking of their own.
Yeah.
The last case study, I was really intrigued by, the researcher who then started to kind of propagate seeds and trying to help the population. Is that what part of your role is when you're monitoring the rare, endangered, and threatened plants? Is it pushing into the kind of human intervention with like seed collection and seed propagation and those types of things?
For sure. Yeah. A lot of the plants that I work on are sort of at the point where we kind of have to step in. And so we don't really have the facilities at DCNR to be collecting seeds or growing seeds, but I actually went out earlier this week with a researcher from Longwood Gardens and helped him collect some seed of a plant I've been working on. He's interested in trying to propagate it. And so, it's not going to live at Longwood forever. So now it's my job to figure out where we might want to plant it out at, if it's going to go back where it came from, if we're going to start a new population, how we're going to track that, and those sorts of things. But it's kind of like, assembling a whole crew of people that do all sorts of different things to help us figure out how to recover some of these plants.
Okay, great. So in fall, if you're out monitoring plants and you see that their seeds are mature, I mean, would you guys help kind of spread the seeds in the natural areas, or do you just kind of let them be?
We have guidelines of like what extent of intervention. So normally we try to collect 10% of seed, and depending on the way that the seed is, sometimes if we want to collect from lots of different plants, we'll sort of like open up a seed capsule and take 3 for us and then drop the rest on the ground and put that in an envelope. And then we'll do that for all the plants you want to collect from. But we never want to collect from more than 10% of the population, unless it's a really dire circumstance, and then we can collect up to 25%.
Sure. I'm also curious, do you all do, like, because these plants are on these certain lists, are there herbariums samples, like sheets for these? I mean, as far as like recording them for posterity, and are you collecting seed to put in like a seed vault? So if for some reason it actually did go extinct, that we might have some traces of it?
Yeah, those are really great questions. We do have herbarium vouchers for a lot of them that are kind of old, normally from when the populations were larger and botanists first were finding them. So we actually did county inventories as the heritage program back in the 60s, 70s. And so there's a lot of vouchers from back then. And then as far as seeds go and saving those, we are working on an agreement with the Missouri Botanic Garden to get them to take some of our seed. They're really interested in it. Just tangled up in bureaucratic state lawyers and litigation right now to get all of our signatures, but we're really excited to work with them. We have some seeds at Marsby as well in New York. And we're looking for other local seed banking partners, so potentially Longwood Gardens or Mount Cuba, some with a smaller bit of local capacity. Just the idea of don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right, right. Gotcha. Well, wonderful. All right, last call. Anyone else out there with questions? All right. Well, Cheyenne, thank you so much for being with us. This was wonderful and a really important topic to be presenting to our audience. And I know that everyone really enjoyed it. So if you are still with us, again, we did record this and I will be sending that link out to you guys early next week. And if you would like to join us next month for our next Third Thursday lecture, that will be Thursday, August 18th, and we'll be tackling Pennsylvania's changing climate with Kyle Imhoff, and he is the Pennsylvania State climatologist. So hopefully you all can join us for that lecture. And Cheyenne, again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And hopefully we'll see you all. Yeah, hopefully we'll see you all again sometime soon. All right, good night, everybody.